Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at Facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and review for us. That'll inspire Apple to promote us a little bit. And, of course, you can also promote us by telling people about the podcast on social media or however else you publicize the things you like. You can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSpod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. All right, I am back from the annual Toronto Comic Arts Festival, otherwise known as TCAF. I had a great time. Got in a good podcast with the cartoonist Chris Reynolds. Got to catch up with a whole bunch of comics pals and past pod guests. Made some new acquaintances who I hope will be future pod guests. And I bought a ton of books. Comic books, which led to a advisement from the Canadian airline I was flying on when they picked up my carry-on on the way home to put it in the gate check. Apparently, I went over the weight limit, although I'm not sure about the kilogram to pound issue that they were bringing up. And apparently, if I do this again, I think they're going to have to ask me politely not to do it a third time. So that's life in Canada. Oh, also, Amy and I hit up a bunch of fine restaurants. I'll give recommendations if anybody asks, and got to share the dining joy. Basically, the last day of TCAF every year, that Sunday, Amy and I always go to our favorite place, Lai Wah Hien, this high-end Chinese restaurant. And this time around, we got to bring one of my good pals, as well as one of my all-time favorite cartoonists, to that end-of-show dinner. I won't drop names because you just get jealous. Oh, and I even got in a good business dinner the first day I was there, bringing a bunch of my member companies together for my, for a networking event, basically, because I can never stop working. Anyway, this week's show features a return guest, but he's returning under some pretty interesting circumstances. Mike Kupperman first did the podcast in 2013, coincidentally at TCAF. We talked about mainly his absurdist humor comics, his work with the UCB improv group, and sort of his place in the comics sphere, given the, again, absurdist humor strips he was doing in the longer form stuff in Tales Designed to Thrizzle. At the time, he mentioned working on a more serious project about his father and his family, but I had no idea what form that was going to entail. 5 years later, that project has culminated in the brand new book, All the Answers, a graphic memoir published by Gallery 13. And when I say brand new, it's coming out today, May 15th, 2018. All the Answers is about Mike's father, Joel Kupperman, who was featured on the Quiz Kids radio and TV shows back in the 1940s and 50s. And we talk about it a bunch in the episode, but just so it's clear, his father did not want to discuss that phase of his life at all, as Mike and his sibling were growing up. And so as an adult, Mike started to do the research and figure out who his father was, what this phase of his life was, and how it impacted Mike and the family going forward, and how Mike is sort of trying to correct for that in his own fatherhood nowadays. It's a real departure. It's a sad story. It's very heartfelt. Mike does a bunch of research into the world that his old man refused to discuss all those years. And it's not exactly a redemption story, but it provides a real sense of coming to terms with the mysteries of the lives of the people we should be closest to. And that is not something I expected from Mike Kupperman based on the very impressive, but, ultimately humorous body of work that he's produced over the years. All the Answers is a really impressive graphic novel. We'll call it a graphic memoir. His drawing style doesn't distract from the story. And as we mentioned in our conversation, you can read this in a single sitting, despite it clocking in at over 200 or so pages. I really enjoyed All the Answers, and you ought to give it a read. And here's Mike's bio. Michael Kupperman's comic drawings and strips have appeared in dozens of publications, including The New Yorker, Fortune, The New York Times, Nickelodeon Magazine, Forbes, Fast Company, Esquire, Heavy Metal, and McSweeney's. Comic books for DC, Marvel, and others, and collections in multiple books, including 5 of his own. They've also been animated for Saturday Night Live, Adult Swim, and Comedy Central. Conan O'Brien described Mike as probably one of the greatest comedy brains on the planet. This is his first serious book, All the Answers. Michael lives in Brooklyn with his family. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Michael Kupperman. Previously, you were known for absurdist humor. Was there a moment where you felt ready to tackle this book and what it is? Or did you have to discover that you were ready in the process of making it?
I had to believe that I could be ready, but it was a hard transition. Part of it came about because of personal imperatives. The situation with my family and the dynamics and how they were changing, that was part of it, and that I realized I had to do this story or else the opportunity would be lost forever. And then there was also the fact that career-wise things had hit a kind of impasse, and I did feel like I had to make a change or else, things were just going to get worse.
And how did this differ in terms of writing? Not the drawing part, but, I guess research and writing and figuring out how to tell this story, as opposed to not just your shorts, but some of your longer tales designed to thrizzle. It's a different mode you're writing in. It feels like, besides just the fact that it's memoir.
Well, most of the best early work is written in a kind of with kind of lightning bolt inspiration. So a section of dialogue will occur to me, or characterization, or some idea I think is intrinsically funny. But with this, of course, it was about telling this story. So first was the research, which took a long time and was very exhaustive. And even then, it was the discovery that starts the book that really pushed me over with the research to something that I could use. But then it was also just thinking about it all and trying to really, think about it for that minute and a half you need to really come up with something that's new. When you start thinking about your own family dynamics, there's a kind of inertia involved, and when you push past that, you start to have some startling realizations.
Can you
Well,
without giving away what's in the book necessarily, can you elaborate on that learning process?
What became apparent was, that it had been a point of trivia in our family for so long that he had been on this quiz show, and something we weren't supposed to bring up because it was clear it would cause him pain. But when I started to think about it, it became obvious that it had influenced him far more than any of us had recognized, and that it had actually reached through him and influenced me, certainly. That there were things he carried over from the show that could almost be described as traumatized responses that he then imprinted on me, which was considerable shock. You don't like to think that you're the way you are because of someone else's trauma, but that's kind of where I arrived.
Yeah, see, I think part of that might be the fact that you weren't raised Jewish. See, to us, we're just a constant chain of trauma. That's really, it just keeps handing down generation on generation. That, I don't want to say sins of the fathers thing, but there's a degree to which we're constantly imprinted by our history and in ways that we don't necessarily see.
Yeah, I've always been curious about that, but I am, as I say in the book, very ignorant of Judaism, and it was kept purposely very foreign from us. As the other when I was growing up.
Mm-hmm. Did you find yourself changing as a father through the course of this?
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, and that was part of it too. I really, when you're a parent, your own childhood is sort of revealed to you, or dimensions that you missed or didn't realize at the time are revealed to you, because as you pass milestones in your child's development, you remember those milestones in your development and how they were handled. And I think you either gain more appreciation for your parents or less. And in this case, it was really, questioning what is a father? What should a father be doing? And of course, I was determined from the outset to be a better father than my father had been. I felt like he had good intentions, but he never was really able to do the work that I think is necessary in this brutal and chaotic world.
Was that a source of resentment for you when you were younger, and something that you're more reconciled to now that you've seen what his life really entailed?
Yes, I'd say that's accurate. I was very impatient and frustrated with him when I was younger. I mean, I recognized from early on that he was a person who was kind of trapped behind a wall of some kind and could not deal with a lot of real world stuff. And that can be very frustrating and embarrassing. And I'm somewhat more forgiving now, although, my temperament is very different, and I tend to be somewhat impatient and, someone who likes to resolve things quickly.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry to turn this into a therapy session right off the top.
No, I've recognized that's what, this book has started that process in a way. I've never been to therapy, but writing it was an intensely difficult process, very painful. And then I've recognized that since then I'm going to be discussing my father and my family in every single interview, which frankly I'm finding kind of interesting. It's unlocking a lot of stuff. Not just personally, but historically and in, larger family history.
Yeah. What are you learning since finishing the book? Unless it's something that's going into a subsequent book.
No. I mean, there's been some reaction from sides of the family, and, I think it actually has, reached out and changed other people's conceptions about what was going on in the family. I've learned some small things. For instance, that when my father didn't meet Henry Ford, he was being kept back. It was a story that he had a cold. My grandmother didn't want him to be exposed to this monster. Little things like that so far. But I know that a lot more is going to come back at me as a result of this book on various angles of it. So I'm curious to see what it is.
Has there been family blowback at this point?
No one's been upset by it. They've all been actually quite positive.
Does it disappoint you? I'm just kidding.
I'm not disappointed. I was worried. I will admit I was worried. But finally, even my mother has read it recently and said she enjoyed it. So that was the last one that was bothering me. Mm-hmm. Of course, my father can't read it, and that's for the best. He probably will never be informed that it exists.
Mm-hmm. Were you on the fence about including yourself and your story as part of this? Or did you feel that was, I'm not judging it one way or the other, but that was necessary for telling this? Was there any point at which you thought of simply telling this historically without?
Yes, at the beginning I would say I thought definitely of telling it historically with as little as possible about me. But it became obvious as I went on that to make it a really compelling story, I had to be in it, and that, the effect of his life as it was conveyed through me, that had to be part of it, which meant my pain had to be part of it. And, that was Not something I necessarily wanted to do, but it was obvious that I had to do it.
And it's laid very bare. I mean, you use a flat image of yourself as a character, but,
Yes.
in exposition, it lays very bare the torment you were going through at a particular phase of your life. How tough was it to commit to that and to put that out in public?
It was very hard. Yeah. No, I would have been delighted if someone had stepped in and said, you don't need to do this. Take this out. Yeah. And I would have been able to believe them. But no, I felt that I had to, I had to put in that my upbringing had basically produced another useless white man in a lot of ways, and there are so many, of us, but, that I hadn't been prepared for anything life threw at me, in terms of emotion or dealing with other people or what you really need to do in this world to have a life. I didn't understand any of that, and it took a horribly long time for me to learn, and I'm still learning. But I had to show the real effect of on me of all of this, because otherwise, what's the point? There's no weight to the story. Mm-hmm. If then you're reducing it again to trivia.
Were there particular memoir / biography templates or, past examples that you went with, either in comics or in prose? That I just want to say that influenced or at least gave you some idea of how to shape it, I suppose.
Well, Stitches by David Small was an influence in the terms of the format, and that his book has very good flow. Mm. And the story moves right through. And that was the one that I read that felt closest to what I wanted to do. I read a lot of graphic memoirs. I felt a lot of them really needed more editing. That the storytelling was not great,
Yeah. What was telling this sort of story like? Again, in terms of writing, figuring out the pace and where to break off and how to shape this entire experience, because it sounds like it was uncharted territory for you, that you were used to the surreal, absurd thing and figuring. When I recorded with Roz Chast a few years ago about the book about her parents' deaths.
Yes.
She said that the biggest revelation came from her therapist, who said when she couldn't explain how to get this book to work, the therapist said, "Have you thought about breaking it into chapters?" And honestly, to Roz, that was oh my God, chapters. Why did I not think of this? Given that you're not accustomed to something 200 pages long, what did you have to teach yourself, I guess, about storytelling?
Well, that actually was part of it. Originally it was kind of just a flow, and there was too much detail. I find a lot about this story fascinating and still do. There's a lot of incidental detail, especially if you're interested in the culture or the personalities of that era. And so a lot of it was editing down. But then when I decided to break it into chapters and give those the rhythm of comic books, so each chapter has kind of the rhythm of comic book. You start on a, rush, you are carried through, and then you end on a sort of almost cliffhanger to the next chapter. And so I felt like that would give the novel some force. I also brought in elements from such things as children's books and detective stories. So this is a story of personal discovery and social history, but I gave it the rhythm of a detective story and wanted it to have that feel of that feeling of force, forced discovery and emotion.
Have you thought of doing when you talk about all the detail and research, like the Pete Bagg biographies, where you have, half the book consists of prose footnotes afterwards, or, again, is that not the...
I'd love to sometimes do a footnoted version, but no, I wanted to tell the story in as bold and straightforward a way as possible. Mm-hmm. And that's what I feel I did do.
You're happy with what resulted?
Well,
happy with it as an artistic product, not.
Yeah, I feel like it's pretty well the book I wanted it to be. There are always going to be things you wonder if you should have changed or included more information or a different angle or realizations that occur to you later. But as far as what it is, I think it's quite strong. Mm-hmm.
You've done a lot of press and a lot of interviews. Most irritating question you get asked?
I only get shirty when people bring up other artists.
Cross that off. Okay.
Right.
Can you talk a little about and this is slightly nuts and bolts, the experience of working with a mainstream publisher, a quote unquote literary publisher, as opposed to working with a comics publisher?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, the comics industry is not in a great state. There's a lot of incredible stuff being produced, but as far as selling and distribution, they're having some serious problems right now. And my publisher became increasingly just unworkable. I couldn't take it anymore. So I had to find someone new, and Gallery 13 stepped forward. And this is a new division of Simon & Schuster. And they don't have a lot of backing, but they're doing graphic novels. And they have great enthusiasm and are really into the process, which is wonderful. So, it's a difficult market. It's a difficult thing to be producing graphic fiction, but I feel like they're doing a really good job. So I'm fingers crossed to see how well this does.
Besides the content side of it, was the editorial process different than what you were used to from a comic side?
Well, there was an editorial process, so that was different.
Okay.
I mean,
you used to just fire and.
Well, when I went into Fantagraphics, I was like, no editing, great. No one's holding me back. They would do a quick edit for grammar. But apart from that, that was it. They never edited for content. And, I was thinking that's wonderful. But when I started to think about doing a more serious book and was, about to move on, I thought I need an editor. I want an editor. Not having an editor is not good. I was also looking at some other graphic novels coming out from them, and it was really clear that an editor could have helped. So, I really wanted a good editor, and I had one, at Gallery 13, Adam Wilson. He's been terrific. Also their copy editing and attention to detail have been just tremendous. So, and they print in America, which makes a huge difference at certain points, because it means you won't have to wait 2 months to get fresh books when you sell out because you've, done an incredibly low print run.
But an amazing press, tour. I'm just kidding. It's
No, they don't have a lot of money to throw around. It's true, even though they're, part of a huge conglomerate. That's just the way things are these days. But they've been very enthusiastic, and so far, we're getting some good attention. So I'm feeling lucky. I
will say it's probably the only book in existence that has blurbs from Julie Klausner, Grant Morrison, and Jake Tapper.
I got Weird Al Yankovic, but unfortunately it's too late to make the book cover.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, paperback down the line. But you straddle a lot of different zones, we'll say. Besides comics itself, you had your UCB history, or sort of the performing side of things. Basically, you're not just a guy who does comics and talks to comics people.
Well, I did a lot of other stuff that when I think something will be funny, that's frequently when I do it. So that was the model with a lot of what I was doing up to a few years ago. But with this book, I'm really trying to reach out beyond comics, and just reach out to normal people who I think will enjoy it. It's not a hard book to read. It's, I've had a lot of people so far tell me, and these are not comics readers, that they've read it in a single sitting. I wanted a book that really spoke to people, that didn't have any. The other thing I saw in a lot of graphic novels and graphic work is a coldness, a distance. Design is very valued right now, but the storytelling and the real emotional weight frequently are missing, and I wanted that to be in there. So, that's also the thinking behind some of the people I was showing the book to and getting blurbs from. That I was very gratified by their response.
And Ken Jennings.
Ken Jennings, of course. I told him I was doing the book several years ago because I knew he would find it fascinating who my father was.
Yeah. How'd you get to know him?
Through Twitter. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's I never know if people have, offline
Julie I know from the real world, but everyone else is either from Twitter or the internet.
Yeah, actually, when you talk about that over-reliance on design, the book is largely two-tier, single panel. There's a couple that are broken up a little further.
Yeah.
Again, was that a conscious on your part in terms of let's not overcomplicate?
Absolutely.
And making sure it fell into that rhythm.
Simple and readable as possible, almost like a children's book for adults. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think it's a simple book or simple-minded. I think there are a lot of ideas in it and a lot that's conveyed. But as far as the delivery, it's meant to be almost like a movie. You're not completely passive reading it, obviously, but it's not a huge amount of effort.
It's kind of a weird question. Seeing that you've gotten to this point, do you find yourself assessing your career? I know you talk constantly in terms of, not constantly, you talk in terms of, your previous work, this work, the state of the comics industry, et cetera. Did a sort of reassessment occur prior to working on this, or is it something you're, sort of in constant looking at what you've accomplished?
A reassessment took prior to this, which is that things had devolved to a nightmare state and I couldn't continue. So this book was really me making a huge gamble that I could still do graphic work and not have it fail. So it's been about 5 years of solid work. I mean, I started it 6 years ago, but it's been 5 years since I absolutely committed to doing nothing else. And
you'd mentioned it when we got together.
2013. 2013 was the last. Yeah, that was the last comic event I attended. And
wow.
I mean, it crystallized perfectly why I was miserable. What I do falls under what's now called alternative comics, and I receive so little respect that it just always depresses me, and I just I couldn't take it anymore. So anyway, this book is a huge gamble, and now we'll see where it goes because I don't know what's next. I can't continue the way I was. Obviously, I had been supporting myself basically through illustration. That's not a career at all. Doing comics as a foot soldier comic artist who is not widely known is also terrible because no one will pay you, or if it's all fallen apart now in our new capitalist society. So basically, this book is my huge gamble. I'm waiting to see where the ball lands on the roulette wheel, and then I will figure out what's next and if I can continue in graphic work at all.
You should launch a Patreon. I'm just kidding.
I don't know. A lot of people have. Yeah. I just, I come from the 20th century, I guess, and it's just, that seems so foreign to me.
Yeah. I guess it is an extension of the people who were self-publishing once upon a time. But again, you've never been in that boat.
Well, that's really, that's a whole set of skills and instincts that people, younger than me, I'm 52, have learned. I came up in print publishing as it was dying, and it was a miserable, awful world. But I have the instincts that I learned, and it goes from before that to the things that my parents taught me, some of which were induced by my father's trauma. Don't attract attention, don't ever get noticed, don't make anyone angry, don't ever and don't blow your own trumpet was a huge part of it. So for me, and I think many people of my generation, self-promotion is intensely difficult. It's a very, very difficult learned skill that's opposite to many things we were taught. So I'm not good at self-promotion. I'm not a great merchant. I'm not a great representative for myself online in the way you're required to be these days. And for all those reasons, I am part of the old order.
You sell yourself short, at least as far as the online presence. You do seem to have built a weird brand, but one that at least on Twitter,
I have some fun on Twitter, sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, as far as being
using that to
leverage anything,
take over the world or something,
right? I mean, I don't do obviously too terribly. I have this book. I mean, part of what. It's interesting when you start to look at this stuff, but part of what I realized I had inherited from my father, and his trauma and his desire to avoid notice and to avoid jealousy and retribution from people who were angry that he was on TV when he was just some guy. I think there was a lot of that. I have a tendency to always put myself and my situation in the most unflattering terms possible. And I did this even when I was at my most successful. I always was saying how terrible it was, nothing was going right. And this has also made life quite difficult for me on occasion, because I paint myself as a loser, kind of as an instant reflex.
And you say you're not really Jewish. That's what's I'm just kidding. It's
yeah.
Self-deprecation being our
sure
ongoing mode. Can you talk a little about the research aspect of this? Not the home life personal research, but I assume having to go find old footage, having to find documentary evidence about about Quiz Kids and your father's life.
Well, most of it was online.
Yeah.
And online has become fascinating. It's like having a huge attic open to you of people's memories. I did the research, I would say mostly 2013, 2014. And I don't know if it would be as easy now. It seemed like a good point in the internet when Google was working properly, and there were a lot of sources open that have closed since. So I did a huge amount of research online, and then some, in person at places like the Paley Library and the Columbia Rare Books Library, looking at Louis G. Cowan's personal papers. The Paley Library and the librarian there, Jane Klein, were very helpful, and I found out a lot of interesting stuff. They had the original when Quiz Kids was being broadcast on NBC, the system for keeping track of the shows was typed file cards, which she showed me and I copied. And there were cards for every show they did, and typed out list of the stations being added through 1949. It started with, I think, one or two stations at the beginning of 49, and then by the beginning of 1950, it was nationwide on the network that NBC was building. So stuff like that was invaluable.
And your father had started an autobiography?
He had, yes, he had written an autobiography, and it's one where the desire to avoid talking about oneself, or
it's kind of self-defeating at that point.
Yeah, no, it was completely self-defeating. He did two very short chapters, and completely just it's him trying to avoid talking about Quiz Kids or anything associated with, or give the reader anything that they might want. It's funny because I'm listening to Steve Coogan's autobiography right now, and it's reminding me of that.
How so?
Well, it's an interesting book, and he's a fascinating person and a bit of a hero. But the desire to not talk about oneself and the stress it's causing him is obvious in nearly every sentence. It's not as bad as with my father, who simply could not, go near anything, and so. He starts talking about the Quiz Kids in chapter 2, and then veers off into some anecdote about someone who approached him afterwards who had some theory to rival Einstein's and needed help getting experts to listen to him. It's just, he doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want to remember it at all.
Mm-hmm. When you were growing up, I know it was off limits topic. Was there a degree of was it a mystery to you, or was it one of those things because it's family, you totally internalize it and don't think there's anything weird about the fact that this existed and no one talks about it?
Yeah, I'd say it was the second one. We just, when you're not supposed to be interested in something, if you present it to other people, you present it as uninteresting.
Yeah. And
I think most people will just go ahead and accept that. I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you're talking to someone and they describe parent, and you point out something that they'd never thought of, such as, it sounds like your father was in the CIA.
That would explain so much.
Yeah. It's like that. So, Yeah, it just receded and became uninteresting. Like, who would be interested in this? No one. It's not, of any worth. But then there was also a period in my 20s when I was becoming very interested in old comedy, and I loved the Marx Brothers. And then to open a book and see a picture of him with Chico was a shock. And as I've realized, he met or performed with so many of the top comedians of that day. But he had converted that into a general distaste for comedy by the time I knew him.
Did your interest in comedy work in any sort of rebellion against your dad as an absence, or was it something you weren't aware of until you started?
I'm sure it was all involved with rebellion against. Yeah. He sent me away to private school when I was 14, which I think was a horrible, horrible decision, very stupid, and I didn't put it in the book. I didn't put a lot of painful stuff in the book because I wanted to just keep to the essential points I was trying to make. But I think he had this image of me as being part of the world he was in someday, which was a world of, facts and order and quiet contemplation and, very serious thought. And yes, I think a lot of what I've done since then has been a rebellion against that. It backfired. Whatever he was trying to do backfired.
You also seem to imply that he didn't really take an active hand in inculcating that in you, just sort of assumed this is how I am, therefore my son must be math, philosophy, order.
Yeah, without actually talking to me about those things. Yeah. No, I think, and I don't think he understood who I am. And in fact, part of my personal struggle in my life has been to understand who I am. I feel like I was raised to be something very different from what I am. And that includes even physically. I found that, I realized in my 30s that I had been clenching my body inwards my entire life. And I started doing yoga and Pilates and realizing that actually it was meant to expand a little bit more than I had been allowing it. I had been literally pulling myself in my entire adult life.
Replicating your old man's posture or simply repressing everything about who you were?
I think repressing everything about who I was, but it was also, there was a thing being talked about a lot when I was young, when they were professors, the mind-body connection. And the idea that it was difficult to have a lot of mental things going on, but still have your body connected and have it perform and do what you needed it to do, and how difficult that was. And I think both my parents and a lot of people of that era felt very distanced from their bodies. And so I think that was kind of what they imparted to me, and that's another thing I've had to kind of struggle against, is the idea that your body is just something that, is supposed to carry you around and do this or that, but you shouldn't really worry about it too much or feel too much connection to it.
Which is weird, because I've got Creota Wilberg at some point I need to record with about her new book on cartoonists, particularly being, contorted and bent into little tiny pretzel shapes from all their cartooning.
Well, I would recommend yoga and Pilates to them too. I don't have any back problems. So, but this kind of self-abnegation that I really, didn't and don't find attractive.
And that, in a sense, drove you onto stage and drove you into doing public.
Well, I'm not a great performer. I do wonder if I hadn't had all this as part of my,
that sense of shame.
Yeah. If I hadn't, put it this way, if I hadn't had all this software installed in me, would it have been different? And I think maybe I would have gone into performance or comedy writing or something. But I think, I had also been kind of raised to believe that some things were too frivolous to do, which sounds insane coming from me, but and I think life
is rebellion.
By the time I left high school, I had no confidence as a performer and probably never will again. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I guess that brings back to how does it affect how you are as a dad? What are you encouraging your son that you recognize, I didn't get this when I was a kid? I'm fixing something maybe that I didn't have, without pushing him into the, son, you should be doing this.
Well, my wife had kind of a rough childhood too, with less than ideal parents. So we both are united in our belief that we can do better. But it's not just about showering our child with love and, telling him he's special, which of course we do. But it's also about trying to raise someone who can deal with the world as it is. I think just laying back and letting the educational system do most of the work is appalling. And it's like I said, a brutal, chaotic world. And if you don't try to give your child some of the wisdom you have hopefully amassed in your life, then you really are not doing your job as a parent. I find being a parent exhausting and sometimes quite frightening and sometimes quite depressing. But that's because I'm putting the work in. I think that's in a way how it has to be. Not to be too much of a downer about it. But what we're encouraging in our son is a belief that he can handle problems, that he can do well, even being a moral person, and that he can, he can do things. I mean, he's 9 and he's at a very interesting stage because at that age, children have one foot in being a toddler still. They have great nostalgia for it. And then part of them is already in the adult realm. They're already figuring out things. They're already doing calculations. It's this insane mix. To infantilize them at that age is, I think, a real mistake. But you can't expect them to behave like adults either. And you have to always remember that anything you're saying to them, especially if it has any weight, the adult is in there listening to you already. So, whatever you're saying to them will be dissected later on by the adult that they're going to turn into. So I think you also have to be aware of that as well. But I feel like we've enabled our son to believe that his creative activity is worthwhile and that he deserves respect as a person and of course needs to treat every other person on the world with respect as well. And we do feel we've enabled him to agree that we were not. And that is exhausting, too, because an enabled 9-year-old artist is really something.
Except you have warned him off of becoming a cartoonist. Right?
Well, I mean, maybe if he prepares better or has some more realistic expectations of the world. I actually I'm using him as an assistant right now. He's doing lettering for me, and I'm trying to train him to do portrait photography and stuff because these are things I need done, and he's a very focused person, and you have to keep him busy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what do you learn from him?
Oh gosh, so much stuff. He's, his confidence as an artist is amazing. He doesn't pencil. He just jumps in with the pen and starts drawing and, he's just a fountain of work, presented with complete confidence. And I envy that very much. He still has a generally sunny attitude, which I'm very proud of. And, when someone says, as sometimes happen, you two look exactly alike, I take it as the highest compliment possible because he's a very beautiful guy and, has generally just a great attitude.
Now, ask about your dad. A few months ago, I did a podcast with Ann Hulbert,
yes,
who has a book on the history in America of rearing child prodigies.
Right.
And what each of the examples she brings up said about the understanding of who kids were in those
right.
particular moments in the 20th century, largely. And also showed how almost to a person, their adult lives were awful. Your dad doesn't, you don't consider your dad a child prodigy.
He certainly didn't. His point was that a child prodigy, in fact, is someone who masters a skill early on, displays an extraordinary aptitude at it, then matures, and the skill develops, and they do even more amazing work, which obviously didn't happen with him.
Which actually holds up with Ann's book. A lot of them peak, burn out early, and their adult lives are not ones of achievement.
I think there are a lot of factors at play. I didn't read her book. I read an excerpt. I don't know if she addressed all of them. With my father, the question was he a real prodigy? And the show destroyed his, and the notoriety destroyed his interest in math? Or was he, somewhat inflated kid with a good memory and some amazing calculation skills, but not perhaps a real prodigy, which is what he felt. What I felt looking at the show was that he and Ruth Duskin, who wrote a book about it later and sort of remained fixated on the show for the rest of her life, they joined the show when they were very young. My impression was that the children who joined the show when they were somewhat older, like Harv Bennett and Richard Williams, who I think joined when they were 11, had a much more healthy attitude towards it, enjoyed it, got what they could out of it, and didn't let it really warp their later lives. Mm-hmm. So I think the age at which the attention comes is a huge factor. The way in which you're treated as a result of it. I think my father and Jared Darrow were both somewhat similar in that they both were put on the show when quite young, given a huge amount of attention. And with Gerard, obviously, it went very bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, did you? I'm blanking on whether this is the case from the book. Interact with some of your father's peers?
No, I had phone conversations with one or two of his old classmates, but there was nothing I really got from.
Yeah, the other ones who were on the show with him. I mean.
No, I never did. I might have contacted Harv and or Ruth, but they both did me the discourtesy of passing away. As I was finishing the work on this. And Richard is the one who is still alive, I believe, but I haven't talked to him.
Mm-hmm. What do you see coming next? I know everything is right now fixated on this nexus point of whether this is a success or not, but if this goes off well.
Don't know. I really don't know. Mm-hmm. It really depends on if this book does well or does anything. It's just so hard to say. Mm-hmm. I just have no idea. There are possibilities, there are things that may happen, but as you said, I finished this book really only about 6 weeks ago, so I am still thoroughly exhausted from it. And
you've been decompressing with any surreal, any of your old style work, or are you just not cartooning right now?
Well, no, and actually. I was doing a weekly strip for most of the time I was doing the book. I felt like actually paradoxically to what you might think, doing other work at the same time would make the style of the book more conversational and less fussy, which is one of the main things I was anxious to avoid. My style can sometimes be quite off-puttingly fussy or overly detailed or mannered, and I wanted to avoid that. So I did a weekly strip for Adult Swim through most of last year, and I was also doing a strip for Vice for parts of it. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as the book was done, kind of the impulse to do anything has left me because I just felt spent. I am actually working on a couple of pieces, though, right now. I just finished one for SpongeBob SquarePants, and I'm doing a longer piece for the Nib about Henry Ford, his encounter with my father, and the resurgence of anti-Semitism, which seemed like old history when I was doing the book, but now is suddenly quite fresh again.
Funnily enough.
Yeah.
Not so funny, but.
Yeah. Well, as I say in this piece, in the period I'm talking about in the book, it's obvious that the media and the government were working together hand in hand to combat white nationalism, white supremacism, and Nazism. And now they seem to be kind of doing the opposite.
Yeah.
Enabling it to an amazing degree with their misuse of the on the other hand style of writing.
Yeah. Both sidesism. That's,
yes. Yeah. It's really poisoned everything.
Yeah. How much is using Twitter to express, your political interests, A, matter to you, B, become a source of frustration?
Well, I try not to express too much genuine political opinion of any kind, but of course,
you leak out sometimes.
Yeah, it's hard not to react to the puppet show that Twitter has become. Obviously, sometimes it can turn some people off. I don't think any of my views are particularly that extreme. I just, hypocrisy is tiring to witness displayed in front of you day after day. And then, a lot of my politics are simply what's expressed in the book. And arise from that. I don't like any kind of racism or any efforts to oppress any other group because you can't be bothered or because acknowledging their needs makes you uncomfortable. I don't think that's okay. And I think, a lot of people are still stuck in the 20th century, and it's over, and they need to accept that there are new standards now, that people want new standards.
Yeah, I was telling my previous guest today that I'm very thankful none of my guests so far have been Me Too'd yet. Which is, we happen to be looking at our bookshelves, and this weekend's literary Me Too casualty was there, and it was I almost recorded with that guy, but we haven't done this yet, so going to hold off on adding someone who the conversation will turn increasingly problematic.
I mean, I was raised in a pretty feminist household, so I was actually raised with, the idea that women are
human beings.
Yeah, and equal to men, and in some ways, can be stronger, as was demonstrated in my household.
Yeah. How did your mom react to the book?
She recently read it, and she was positive. I was quite relieved. I obviously didn't. Wasn't an attack on either one of them, and it wasn't meant to demean my parents or say anything hurtful. But beforehand, I said, you may have to be prepared. It's not perhaps the most positive thing. And she said, well, what's the worst thing you said? And I said, well, maybe that you were very preoccupied with your career and weren't the most attentive parent. And she thought about it for 3 seconds and shrugged. So,
yeah,
I think we're going to be okay. And my sibling, who asked not to be in the book, has read it and seemed positive. And then also my grandmother, my father's mother's other children, I think the book has been spreading around through them. They live out in California, but so far a good response.
Even though your grandmother is sort of
no one disagrees with that.
The person who forced your father into this.
Yeah.
Or kept your father in this.
There's
this
still
world.
Questions I have about her and my grandfather. I mean, he especially, he comes off as such a passive, withdrawn presence. And so far I have not found anything to contradict that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the showbiz mom instead.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, even in the books and coverage of that period when people were extraordinarily polite and held things back, she was being referred
she was
to
pushy.
as a stage mother. Yes.
You see this going musical a la Alison Bechdel, by the way?
That would be
Fun
interesting.
Home?
Yeah. No, yeah.
But to be frank, having read that, at no point did I think, wow, this could be a musical. That's
It's an interesting choice, but it was quite successful, right?
Yeah. Yeah. See, this could be your sideline. Again, we've mentioned the UCB people, Weird Al, etc. Are you hearing back from cartoonists about the book? Are you hearing back from any of your peers, and do you consider yourself? I know you don't want to discuss other cartoonists in general, but
well, again, and from the people I've shown it to, generally a positive reaction.
Yeah.
And then from the wider thing, I'm trying to reach out past comics, so I don't know. I don't know if that's the reaction I really care about, to be honest.
Sure. I just wasn't sure if it was any of your old time pals saying, "Holy crap, Mike, that was a great book."
No. People have been very enthusiastic. It's great, and Grant Morrison, who I
what connection do you have with him? That was
he said positive things about my work before, and so he was one of the first people I wanted to show the book to when I was done, and I managed to find people using Twitter who knew people who knew him, and they got. He agreed to read it, and he was very enthusiastic, and that was absolutely thrilling to me because I think he's the best storyteller in superhero comics.
Yeah, the last superhero book I've read was that Superman 12-issue thing, the sort of standalone thing, and I thought, okay, this is recapturing something that I dug, but generally, yeah, I've.
He's an amazing storyteller. There are a lot of talented people working on superhero comics, but I think he's at that sweet spot where he can come in and deconstruct the mythology. And he does it so brilliantly.
Now, I will say almost 20 years ago, I reached out to him back when I was doing small press publishing to see about getting the rights to one of his weird esoteric art books from the UK. I got a phone number for him. And again, this is like 2000, 2002.
Sure.
To this day, I'm not sure if it was his or not, because it was such a heavy I got a voicemail, and it was such a heavy Scottish accent. I thought maybe I was on the set of Train Spotting, and I subsequently interviewed Irvin Welsh and had the same experience. But yeah, Morrison's Scottish brogue. I was just like, I don't know what this person said, so I'm just going to leave a message and hope this was him. Never heard back, so it's possible Neil Gaiman was screwing with me and just gave me some other number. But
yeah.
But again, not concerned about comics so much as a bigger world.
Right.
Did you?
Well, I mean, I feel with comics. It's all about categorization. I mean, it's,
So I was going to ask that. Around the last major work of yours, A Tales Designed to Thrizzle, they're great comics, but figuring out the category and the audience for them.
Well, I mean, it's not like I made this book deliberately to address everything that was wrong with my career, but it does go opposite to a lot of what a lot of the problems I was struggling with. Part of the problem for me was that my old work I couldn't get written about. My old work is in a sense about the absence of meaning. It's just trying to be funny. And there's no angle there for anyone to write about. And it's hard for them to even to review. Some of the sense of humor is very abstract for, let's just say it, normal people. So, I felt like, that was one of the reasons why I didn't get any attention or any respect. It's not, humorous comics are not where the people who are steering comics want them to be. That's not, without any additional meaning. That's not something that's, looked on very well these days. Mm-hmm. So, in a way, my book is, the new book is 180 degrees from all that.
But you still work on funny.
Well, we'll see. I don't know.
Yeah. I just mean internally. I mean, do you find
Right now, I don't know. I am pretty worn out from this book. I may have occasionally an idea that makes me laugh, but I don't have a strong urge to do any funny comics right now.
Mm-hmm. No, a sequel to Black Godfather of the Ants.
Right. Yeah. But again, we'll see. You never know.
How important is respect? You brought that up a few times.
Well, it gets exhausting. I'm in New York. I've lived my entire adult life in New York. I have lived, 22, 23 of the last 30-something years in Brooklyn. I've never been invited to panel at a Brooklyn comics event. I'm never invited. There's this sense of low expectation attached to me. The alternative comics is ruled by a fairly small set of people, and I know some of them don't respect my work at all. So I'll never be, in Best American Comics again. I will not be invited to any, even if I'm invited to a con as a guest, I won't be invited to do anything. There's this consistent sense of kind of being shown. I mean, at the event we last spoke at, wait,
Toronto.
Was it TCAF?
Yeah,
oh no,
Toronto.
TCAF was great. TCAF was an absolute
I remember they had you and Jack Cohen do a panel.
Fantastic. I nothing against TCAF. Right after that, I did SBX, and it was much more the kind of thing I'm used to here, where
You signed some stuff. I remember you were in your Mark Twain.
Stuff. I did a panel with another cartoonist. We were kind of shoved into, a theater with wires hanging from the ceiling, while in the main theater there was a panel going on about humor in comics at the same time.
Which, God forbid, they invite you to.
It was fairly transparent. So, I just feel like comics have disappointed me over and over, to be honest. And my publisher was part of this too. I mean, my comics actually sold, at least at the beginning when they were still bothering to do the formalities of promotion and distribution, they sold quite well for them. Better than a lot of their other product. They still couldn't be arsed, as the English say. It just wasn't, they didn't understand it. They didn't want to put in any energy to it. And, that was how it went. It was like years of feeling like I was drowning and looking around for someone to support me. The publisher couldn't do it. I couldn't get a regular gig anywhere that would help me. I mean, my experience has been that any media outlet or publisher that starts a comic section, any magazine or such or newspaper, loses interest usually within 8 to 10 months. Yeah. And then they want to do something else. And things like that have been my experience over and over and over. It's, we're living in very tough times for people who do what I do. So, the fact that I couldn't get any respect at all or any attention from the alternative comic side, that felt like salt in the wounds. I mean, as many of the reviewers pointed out, I was doing comics that weren't anything else but comics. They weren't designed to be expanded into TV or
a musical.
A musical. Yeah, well, they weren't anything else but comics, and yet comics totally wasn't interested.
It reminds me of last weekend. I was talking with Howard Chaykin at a superhero and cosplay event because Howard was there.
Yeah.
And he'd said something to the effect of Kevin Feige, the Marvel Entertainment guy.
Yeah.
He said his greatest achievement was making billions of dollars out of something that's worth nothing. So comics aren't worth anything.
Yeah.
Nobody is going to like a Black Panther movie and then turning around and buying a bunch of Black Panther comics. They don't care.
Yeah.
He made billions off of things that people consider worthless. That comics as comics are not,
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's rough. And it's, again, the trickle down economy is one of the worst myths of my lifetime. And we've seen its profound failure. And, part of it, none of that Marvel money goes back down into the comics, as I know very well. It only travels upwards.
That's what money does.
Yeah.
Last question. When you were growing up, we'll say 20s and your 30s, did people see your name and ask if you were Joel Kupperman's kid?
Yeah, it stopped some point in the 80s. I remember distinctly a point, I was in college and someone said, "Are you related to?" And I thought, "Oh, here it comes." And they said, "Sam Kupperman, who has the fur store downtown."
Oh, thank God.
Yeah. And after that, there was one more person, but one of those people who reads a lot of old stuff and has a head full of trivia. During the 70s, people would ask occasionally. Yeah, mm-hmm. It was still somewhat in the public consciousness, but by the 80s, it was gone. The last gasp was the book that Ruth Duskin wrote, and then there was some media attention, but that quickly dissipated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just wondered how much of this sort of trailed you, even if you weren't trailing your dad, that, it was still coming to haunt you over the years. It was there, obviously. If you look at my comics, I was surprised to see when I thought about it, how many references there were, veiled references in my comics to his career and that kind of mythology. But you do have boy geniuses running around periodically.
Yeah,
but,
and there's that strip, Boy Bank. There are several direct references there taken from an old strip about the Quiz Kids that Mark Newgarden gave me. But there was, I don't know. There's an interview. My father did not give any interviews after 1959, but he sent a letter to someone else involved with Quiz Kids. I'm not sure who, when there was this fresh media thing in the 80s. And the letter says, "That's my childhood. I don't want to talk about it anymore." And he also refers to his children who are not Quiz Kids, which, I think really summarizes what he wanted for us. He wanted us to be normal. Whatever that is, but he didn't recognize how deeply abnormal we are. And to return to an earlier question, I think that's one of the things we've done with our son is we've recognized from the start he is not a normal person. It's not that we've driven him into anything or tried to, push him in any direction. I really have tried not to. But he is a person of such abnormal drive and focus. That, you have to recognize that.
I will leave you with that. I think it's a good point for us to end the conversation.
Sure.
Mike, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Gil. Thanks for having me.
And that was Michael Kupperman. His website is michaelkupperman.com, and his new book is All the Answers, which is out today, May 15th, 2018, from Gallery 13. I hope we gave you enough of an idea of what it's about and how Mike tells the story of his father's Quiz Kids career and the long-term ramifications of that childhood exposure. I enjoyed all the answers a lot, and if you're a regular listener of the show, chances are you will too. You should follow Mike on Twitter at @mkupperman. That's a little more up-to-date than the michaelkupperman.com site. And Kupperman is Kupperman. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Mike, so, who you reading? If you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The newest episode of that one features 40 minutes of new material from Dave McKean, Paul Karasik, Mark Newgarden, Seymour Quast, John Leland, Ann Hulbert, Henry Wessels, Lauren Weinstein, Jerry Beck, Willard Spiegelman, Levi Tadar, Jesse Scheidlauer, and Robert Weil. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project that I really have to get back to, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode as part of a batshit crazy 4 podcasts in 3 boroughs of New York day. Mike was the second guest in the second borough. The whole day, ultimately, there was gas money, but it was really just a bunch of toll bridges, about $16 for parking, 2 subway trips for another $6, and just a lot of driving, along with a coffee break. So if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, parking, or if you just want to toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallace Wildy Minozzi, Noah Van Skyver, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Lescamella, Joe Caruso, Paul Karasik, Michael Janizik, and Stephen Solomon for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. Next week's guest will be Ilana Meyer, author of the new novel Fire Dance. She was the first guest in the first borough 2 Saturdays ago when I drove all over New York. So, until then, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube and tunein.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll help us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.